Hello, friends. Well, it's been a rough couple of weeks. This is the first time I've recorded since Charlie Kirk's assassination, and that was a lot to take in. It was so traumatic and shocking. Um, my son was on the UVU campus. He wasn't at the event, but he was in a building just doing his homework, and he started to hear shouts of gunfire, there's gunshots. And so he's actually in law enforcement. So he went downstairs and outside, kind of against traffic, to go see if there was anything he could do to help with whatever was going on. And of course, by the time he got there, people were being dispersed and told to go away from the area. And so he went, he ended up going back into the building, and he saw one of his teachers who was herding people into the class and saying, we're going to lock down for a little bit here. So he told her that he was trained and armed and was able to stand guard outside the class for an hour while they were in lockdown. Just so rough to see a voice silenced like that, and such a voice of truth and a voice of sincerity and genuinely wanting to build bridges and come to a meeting of the minds and have people speak that Charlie Kirk didn't agree with. He welcomed their voices. And so to have someone like that gunned down is just shocking, of course. I'm not saying anything new here. It's just very disturbing, of course. And I guess it just sort of hit home in a tiny little way, in a very small way, because we sometimes see people in our sphere, this kind of anti-polygamy sphere, whatever we want to call it, silenced in smaller ways, not that dramatic, but still really hard to deal with. Obviously, Michelle Stone being told to take down her videos or face church discipline. Whitney Horning, as I understand it, at least for some time, I don't want to misspeak, but at least at one point, I know she was only invited to come to church if she agreed to keep her opinions to herself. So that's pretty rough to see as well. And there's a lot of that goes on. David Sharp and his wife told to stop podcasting about Joseph Smith or face discipline. What's crazy is that in some sort of bizarre irony, we are a lot of times accused of not listening to the women who talked about polygamy. And it's completely untrue. I've talked about many, many, many of the women who claimed to be Joseph's wives, women who lived polygamously in Utah in the 1800s. Who do you see bringing up Jennie Anderson Froiseth, for instance? Do you even know that name? I'll put a link in the description box to Jennie Anderson Froiseth's work and Catherine Waite, her work. Those two weren't ever members of the church, and maybe that's why they're not listened to, but they gathered dozens of stories of women who were in the church and living polygamously, and the stories of their heartache and the things that they went through. So yes, we are listening to the women, and probably more so than the people accusing us of not listening to the women. And if we only want to focus on women who were members of the church, we can talk about Annie Eliza Webb, who divorced Brigham Young. She told about her experience living in polygamy in Utah. Fanny Stenhouse wrote an incredible, incredible book, her autobiography, called Tell It All, A Woman's Life in Polygamy. So she was a convert to the church in 1848. So after Joseph Smith died, she joined the church a few years later. And incidentally, she gets a few things wrong about Joseph Smith, because obviously the things that she thinks she knows about Joseph Smith, she was told those stories by the polygamists among whom she lived in Utah. So that's why she gets her story wrong about Joseph. But her firsthand accounts of what she saw in Utah, of her neighbors and friends living polygamously, and then eventually her own husband, who had promised never to take another wife, betrayed her and married another woman under pressure from his leaders to live his religion. So he finally buckled and married this young girl. So her firsthand experience with polygamy, as well as her conversations with her friends and neighbors about it, I think we should listen to her as well. I guess someone might balk and say, well, she left the church eventually, which she and her husband finally, it took years before Fanny was able to finally say, I don't think polygamy is of God. She suffered under it for quite a while, always believing that it was her cross to bear that God had placed upon her, until she finally allowed herself to imagine that it maybe wasn't from God. And she read through the polygamy revelation all the way through and was really shocked at what exactly it said in there. And so her husband took some years longer than it took her to realize that it was never of God. And the unfortunate thing is they left everything. They left the Book of Mormon. They left Joseph Smith. They tossed it all because they had it all wrapped up into one, as if Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon and polygamy and the whole church was all wrapped up into one. So when she found out that polygamy was not from God, she tossed everything. And we see that happen today too. It's so sad. And maybe her voice isn't listened to as much as it should be because she left the church, but that seems unfair to only listen to women who suffered under polygamy and stayed in the church. That's going to narrow the pool a lot. If you want to really hear about their experiences objectively, you need to listen to the women who suffered under it and eventually left, which is understandable, right? I've got friends who have left the FLDS church, and we would never listen to their stories of the trauma and horrible things that they went through. We would never say, well, you left your church though, so I'm not going to believe your story. Does that make sense? We would never, ever say that to them. We would believe their stories, even though they left their church and are probably bitter toward their church. We would not dismiss their stories just because they're now hostile to their church. Okay, so I don't think it's fair to do that in our church either. So if someone had a bad experience in the 1850s or 1860s and did leave the church, I don't think their testimony should just be dismissed. So I think we need to listen to those women as well. And I think it's interesting because we also don't believe everything someone says without questioning it. Of course, that wouldn't be smart at all. So when we read, say, Fanny Stenhouse's accounts, it's not that we take everything at face value and just implicitly believe everything she says, but it is interesting because many of the things she says are corroborated, often by Brigham Young himself. For instance, she describes that Brigham explained that he was sick of the fighting and scratching all around him from his unhappy wives. Well, that's Brigham's own words are recorded in the Journal of Discourses. And he says exactly that phrase, scratching and fighting among his wives. So that's corroborated. So that lends credibility to the things that she's saying. And there's other things that she says that, again, they comport with the historical record that we have from Brigham and other church leaders at the time. So I don't think we can just throw her out or other people that were unhappy and disaffected. One that a lot of people are familiar with, they might have heard the alleged quote from Phoebe Woodruff, who had been called upon to defend polygamy publicly, which she did in a mass women's meeting. She defended polygamy and said that she was proud to be called Mormon and proud to be numbered with them, and something like that, as she defended the principle of polygamy. And then her friend, allegedly, asked her a couple of days later and said, but I thought you hated polygamy. And Phoebe is reported to have said, I've not changed. I loathe the unclean thing with all the strength of my nature. But, sister, I would rather stand up anywhere and say anything commanded of me than to be turned out of my home in my old age, which I should be most assuredly if I refused to obey counsel. So sometimes that account is thrown out because it's a secondhand account. And of course, we don't have anything written from Phoebe to express that. But this happens all the time when we're talking about supposed witnesses to Joseph Smith's polygamy. They take second and third hand accounts from 25 years later, 40 years later, 60 years later. So it's a bit of a double standard to dismiss what Phoebe allegedly has said here and others like this, just because we can't verify that she said it. Because there's tons of stuff that we cannot verify that Joseph said that historians typically take without question. And then there are some that are written down, like Emmeline B. Wells, who publicly defended polygamy and then privately lamented and was so deeply sorrowful and miserable. She is the one that you've probably heard this before also, who wrote in her journal, "Oh, if my husband could only love me even a little and not seem so perfectly indifferent to any sensation of that kind. He cannot know the craving of my nature. He is surrounded with love on every side, and I am cast out. Oh, my poor aching heart, where shall it rest its burden? Only on the Lord. Only to him can I look. I have no one to go to for comfort or shelter, no strong arm to lean upon, no bosom bared for me, no protection or comfort in my husband." We listen to the women. Yes, we do listen to the women. Zina Huntington Young is another who defended polygamy. She was a wife of Brigham Young, and it's claimed that she was a wife of Joseph Smith, although we have no evidence of that. And she is quoted in the World newspaper saying, "It is the duty of a first wife to learn to regard her husband with indifference and with no other feeling than that of reverence. For love we regard as a false sentiment, a feeling which should have no existence in polygamy." We listen to the women, and that's what she said openly. And she's not alone. Pamelia Benson, who was married to the great-grandfather of President Benson. "A first wife must learn to cast out all love and affection from her heart if her husband takes other wives." And she said that was the only way she could bear it without just dying of agony when she saw her husband taking other wives, including her sister. So we listen to the women. Several people have had Celine Anderson on their podcast lately, and others. David Snell had Brittany Nash on, and Brittany Nash is the one that I found out a lot of these stories from, and that's what made me dig for more, because it was appalling. It was absolutely appalling. Her presentation at the Fair Mormon conference, at the Fair conference, I think it was 2021. Her presentation could have been called, "Wow, Polygamy is the Worst." Like that could have been the title of it. But she ended by saying, well, they were adults and that they could make their own decisions, which is true, but we have to acknowledge the coercion that went on. Celine Anderson has expressed that how offended she is when people that believe that these women were coerced into speaking as they did or feeling as they did, because she says that we are claiming that they were weak or that they were oppressed and weak and too weak to stand up for themselves. And I've never said that. And I don't think, I haven't heard anyone say that. Maybe someone has, but that's not how I would put it at all. I think some of them were very strong women. And in fact, Emmeline B. Wells, clearly a very strong woman, she said she had no support from her husband. He was not a husband to her, and yet she survived. So I would say they're very strong women. I would never say they're weak. But what they were is coerced. They were taught unequivocally that polygamy was necessary. They needed to live it in order to be saved in the celestial kingdom. In order to have the highest degree of glory, they were taught, they needed to round up their shoulders and live their religion, by which was meant accept polygamy and let your husband marry other women. That is a form of coercion that only would work on someone who is strong in her beliefs about her religion. If you're strong in your belief about your religion and you strongly believe your leaders and they tell you that, that's the only thing that could persuade you to live that way when it went against every feeling of propriety and morality for these women. And yet they did it because they were told by people they trusted and revered that it was necessary and that God wanted them to do it. That is one of the worst types of coercion. So yes, they were coerced. It doesn't mean they were weak, and it doesn't mean that they felt oppressed. It means that they believed what they were taught and tried to live it, even though it made them miserable. Leonard Arrington, he was the only professional historian that has ever been a church historian for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The only professional historian they've ever had. And he was in for about 10 years, from about 1972 to 1982, I think. He combed through so many records, and he saw the testimonies of these women, and he saw how they were taught. And he said that anyone that's looked at the record can't deny that the primary motivation for these women to live polygamously was that they were taught that it was their religious duty. Here's how he says it. Referring to polygamy, he says that its primary justification and the primary motivation of its practitioners was religious obligation. No one who has examined the diaries and letters of the time can deny. I'm going to say that one more time. That the primary motivation of its practitioners was religious obligation. No one who has examined the diaries and letters of the time can deny. All right, that's what Arrington said. And I think I want to share a story right here. So Greg Mattson, I have a lot of respect for Greg. He agreed to meet with me, and we talked for an hour and a half, which was just very kind of him to give me all that time. And I was able to share the movie with him, Woe Unto You, Scribes, The Hidden History of Polygamy. You know, I'm always going to invite you to watch that if you haven't yet, and to share it with friends. And I gave him the written copy of it as well. So I hope he read it or will read it. I really hope that he and his wife will sit down and watch the movie together. But whether or not he does, that's his choice. I do not insist that Greg start thinking like I do. This is not my goal, to have people come to my side or believe as I do. I like that they listen to both sides. That's really all I ask, is that they'll listen to both sides so that they're better equipped to make good decisions. Good inspiration is based on good information, as we have heard. But this is something interesting that happened on his channel, and I don't remember which video it was, but it doesn't matter. He was interviewing somebody, and it may have been the Brian Hales video, or it might have been when he had Celine on. I don't remember. But in the comment section, one lady left a very rude comment to him. And she said something like, you can see that Greg is salivating for his harem or for his polygamous wives or something like that. And it was totally uncalled for. It was extremely rude and inaccurate. I believe Greg when he says that he is no fan of polygamy. I believe it. I felt that that was true when I talked to him. I don't think it's something that he relishes. I think it's unpalatable for him to think about having another wife at some point. So I believe him. And this was just an extremely rude comment. And what was interesting is that Greg is usually pretty measured in the comment section, but on this one, he was very angry at this lady and threatened to block her because it was so inaccurate what she had said and uncalled for that it really got his ire up, and rightly so. It was horrible. And you guys, it hurts me. It hurts my heart when I see people on my side say such rude things that are completely uncalled for and just unchristlike in the extreme. So it really is dismaying to see that kind of comment. So anyway, he got after her. I did too. I said, I've talked with Greg and this is not accurate, and that's not okay. But what I thought was interesting is how angry it made him. And again, rightly so. But why did it make him so angry? I think it's because that is a natural reaction to being accused of looking forward to something as immoral as polygamy, as hurting your wife and taking more wives. And it was very interesting to see how offended he was at that suggestion. The other thing, coupled with this, that I think is extremely important to recognize is that Greg is trying to make peace with polygamy. He does, as far as I know, still believe or tend to believe that it really is doctrinal, that it really is from God. And so he is trying to understand it and come to terms with it and try to make it palatable. He's had guests on to try to explain why polygamy was of God or acceptable or whatever. And I think this is crucial to understand that this is exactly why the women in Utah lived polygamously, even though they felt it was reprehensible, it was horrible, it struck them as immoral, it hurt them, it made them sorrow. They objected to it in every way, but they agreed to live it for the same reason that Greg is trying to get okay with it, which is that the leaders that they sustain have told them that it is from God. Now, no one's going to say Greg Madsen's weak, Greg Madsen's oppressed, none of those things. But he's trying to be okay with polygamy because he believes that it's from God. That is exactly why those women put up with this. So I do not want to hear anyone keep asking that same old awful question. Well, if the women were really so miserable in polygamy, why would they have gone along with it? That's why. That's why. Don't ask that question anymore. We already have the answer, and we have the answer right in front of us right now. So the point is that there are legitimate reasons to give less weight to the testimonies of some of these women. But that doesn't stop all these historians or people aspiring to be historians to tell us that we're ignoring women's voices. It's just the height of irony to me. And what's interesting is that even while they are not paying attention to the women that we think are important to listen to, and they're only listening to half of some of the women like Eliza Snow, they don't find her testimony credible in 1842 when she said that no polygamy was being practiced in the church, but they do believe her in 1869 when she says, oh, no, I was actually married to Joseph already when I said that. So they believe her later testimony instead of her earlier testimony. We've talked about that before. But what might be even worse is that a lot of these historians and apologists are dismissing women's voices right now, current women's voices. My voice, Michelle's voice, Whitney Horning's voice, Gwendolyn Wine's voice, so many. And Keith Erickson, we talked about him several weeks ago. I never got back to the many questions I have for him, but I would like to share this part of one of the firesides that he did. The fireside was an invitation for people to come with their questions, even the hard ones, and ask them anonymously. And so a friend of mine actually asked a question, and she phrased it so well. She really got to the heart of the matter. So I'm going to let you hear it from Keith and how he introduces her question. Pay attention to how dismissive he is for part of the question, and then we'll see what he does with the question after he finishes reading it.
I'm going to read this whole thing. Is there a place in the church for members who are faithful to their covenants, but are now discovering through extensive research of the scriptures, the Joseph Smith papers, prayer, that polygamy is not ever commanded by God, that Joseph, Hiram, and Emma fought polygamy, and Brigham Young and others like Heber Kimball, Willard Richards altered the narrative after Joseph was murdered to fit with what they were doing? Or do these individuals need to be flushed out, punished, and excommunicated for their beliefs?
Okay, that was really well said. I couldn't say it better. That was very well explained, her question. And the reason she asked it is because her friend had actually been excommunicated for believing that Joseph was not a polygamist. The friend didn't have a podcast. She just believed it, and her leaders found that out, and they excommunicated her and her husband. So this was not hypothetical. So it was very important to my friend to ask this question. So this is how Keith addresses the question.
Did you hear that? Did you hear the really strong either or talking about somebody else's sex life?
Okay, to take that very sincere question and reduce it as if it's a question about somebody else's sex life, that's clearly preposterous on its face. But he goes on and misrepresents the question. So listen to this.
The question puts two extremes. One is, I know the truth. Brigham and Heber and Willard made this up. They changed it. It's full of lies. They've put it on Joseph and Hiram. Or do I get excommunicated? You hear that's the way they're framing it.
Okay, that was not at all what she was asking. He completely turned the question around and is not addressing her actual question. Her question was, if I believe that Brigham and Heber and Willard and others are the ones that started polygamy in the church, not Joseph, is there space for me in the church, or do I need to be excommunicated? So it's interesting that right there, having been invited to ask questions, she asked a question and he either didn't understand it or wasn't listening. So right there, he's not listening to her sincere and well-phrased question. And there are other examples of the women right now not being listened to. And ironically, Celine is not hearing us. Even we're talking right now, you can rewind, you can listen to it again and make sure you get it right. And she's still not getting it right. So Celine had a list of things that bothered her about what she perceives people are saying right now. And I could not relate to any of them. One of the things that she said that she sees is people saying that the idea of polygamy makes me uncomfortable. And so that is sufficient proof to prove that it is inherently wrong. And I've never heard anyone say that. I don't think you've heard anyone say that. Whatever was said that she heard like that, she wasn't listening. Another thing that she said bothered her that she was hearing is that Emma Smith's viewpoint is the only woman's perspective I'll engage with. So that was another one of her complaints. Again, I've never said that. I've never heard anyone say anything like that. That would be extremely irresponsible. So I don't know if she actually heard someone say that, if she could quote them. I don't know who it would be, but it's none of the prominent voices in this movement. They would never say anything like that at all. We're listening to the women, and we would never say we only want to listen to Emma. So again, she's not listening. She's not listening. And I do want to add a final thought, and it is about Emma Smith. And while she is far from the only voice we listen to, I think it is very, very important to listen to her testimony, to not dismiss it. Another huge irony is when we're told that we don't listen to the women, and Emma's testimony is the first one tossed out and dismissed as untrue, that she had motivations for saying the things she did, even though her testimony is one of the very few testimonies that is consistent. She never changed her story. She was always saying the same thing, that her husband never practiced polygamy, that she was his only wife, and that the rest of it was untrue and made out of whole cloth. So I think it's important to listen to her historically, because it's good historical practice to prioritize testimonies that are firsthand testimonies, contemporaneous, and where the person has not contradicted himself or herself. And Emma fits that perfectly. Her testimony was consistent, it was repeated, and she stuck to her story her whole life. This is a woman who made perhaps bigger sacrifices than just about anyone else in the restoration of the gospel. She lost children. She lost her husband. She was reduced to poverty in her dedication to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the stories we tell about her are horrific. We prioritize, again, second and third hand accounts given decades after Joseph's death by women who contradict themselves, who gave incorrect dates, provably incorrect dates for their stories, and whose stories contradict what we know about Emma's character from contemporaneous records of Emma, how she was thought of in the community. And she was very highly respected in her community. And yet these accounts of women 25 years later that tell about her stomping on watches, that tell about her burning revelations and being awful to live with, they contradict Emma's words, they contradict what Joseph said about Emma, and they contradict what's known about Emma at the time. So to prioritize these awful, uncorroborated stories about Emma over the consistent testimony of the elect lady, the mother of the restoration, is to me unconscionable. So I don't know if any of this was helpful today. I feel like I'm venting or getting some things off my chest, but I feel like they needed to be said. And silencing voices, whether through violence or through abuse of authority, is not a godly principle. Joseph Smith taught that we should be free to think as we wish. And I love that he taught that. I love that he taught that he did not want to be trammeled in his views, and he wanted to be free to think as he wished. So I'm so thankful for his teachings on that, and hope that we can adhere to those teachings ourselves. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.